Hello, I'm Jonathan Ford, and I'm the author of my memoir entitled Depression, Oil Trading, and a Mind at War with Itself. The book, as it suggests, focuses a lot on my very long term struggles with depression, and I attempt to explain that in regard to, I believe, the three ways that I think depression can result in an individual, which are basically a chemical imbalance, a sort of propensity developed perhaps in childhood through the way you are brought up, and then by virtue of circumstances that confront you in life. And I've written my entire life story from my growing up in the United Kingdom, through my days in Oxford, and then my working life beginning in London, until I then moved to the United States in 1990, where I've lived consistently since then. I think in my childhood I've shown that I did have some angry episodes. I was a very serious child. My father was an alcoholic, which obviously had a bit of a negative effect, to say the least. And my mother was very loving, but very academically interested, and made my brother and I focus very much on our school efforts. And we became somewhat perfectionists, and we tended to not really celebrate success, but rather focus on the absence of success, if ever there was any. So I believe that led to me becoming a little bit focused on the negative of things. And my mother was also somewhat judgmental and negative and critical, and really a little bit frightened of her own shadow, for want of a better term. So I attempt to explore that side of my life until I'm about 27 and I come to the United States, where I show that I do have some periods of depression. I entered a career in oil trading where I worked for some of the largest companies in the world for around 20 years. And obviously, as one can imagine, trading any commodity or financial instrument is very stressful. A lot of money is at stake. But I think what happened to me was, although I found the job extremely interesting and exciting and fascinating and fun and rewarding, I focused again very much on trying to be a perfectionist, which is essentially impossible in the world of trading. And for better or worse, I focused on the side of trading which is really speculative, basically trying to predict the direction of, simply speaking, the oil price up or down, which again is almost impossible to do with any great degree of consistent success, and obviously lends itself to making many decisions which are immediately judged by the market and can immediately be viewed as right or wrong. And when I made a wrong decision, I would really get down on myself. I would be incredibly self-critical, self-flagellating mentally. It would lead to me to often go home at night, and this is when I was in London or Geneva in the early days, and lie in my bed and cry perhaps, or just lock myself away and just dwell on the negativity, and I felt such a worthless failure. And these periods would be relatively frequent and consistent, maybe once every couple of months. I'd usually, though, get over them in 24 to 48 hours max, and then simply go on my way again. I actually viewed it in hindsight as saying that maybe during this time in London and Geneva, I was maximum suffering from depression and feelings of worthlessness and sadness, all-consuming sadness, about 20% of the time max. Now, in 1990, I moved to the States, and since then, I've looked back in hindsight and said that my depression to non-depressed ratio switched completely, and it was more like 80% depressed, which is obviously very serious and troublesome. Again, the trading was very stressful. I would focus very much on the negativity of my failings. Foolishly, I tended to focus on the speculative side of the business, which is absolutely not necessary, and many people are extremely successful without putting themselves under the stress of that type of speculation. But for whatever reason, I think I wanted to prove that I could do something which was almost impossible to do, and which was incredibly unsuited to my personality, which was one of great self-criticism, negative thinking, and desire for perfection, because I tend to think that in my childhood I was always expected to be largely academically perfect. I do recall in 1996 I had one of my best years ever trading, and yet during that year I would go home at night and lie in my bed and literally cry for maybe an hour, write in my diary about how I hated my life, how I was trapped in a prison, how I just wanted it all to end, how there was never any way out, and it was absolutely devastating. And also at that time I had two young children, and it wasn't a very good condition mentally to be in, given that I did have the two young children to look after along with my wife. Now, furthermore, in 1990 or 1991, I got married, and I've been married twice, in 1991, again in 2001, 2003. I was divorced for the second time about a year ago. And this brings me more to the circumstantial element of what I think can be depression. I already have the propensity, I think, from my childhood. I must have a chemical situation. I've been on antidepressants since about 1992, and they did definitely have some positive effect, although many times I felt they were just swamped by circumstances. And those circumstances were largely, since 1991, two very difficult marriages. My first marriage was very difficult. I felt that my life had changed so dramatically. I couldn't recognize myself. I felt I was living a life that wasn't congruent with who I was. I felt I no longer was who I was. I couldn't comprehend the new society and the culture that I'd kind of got myself into, i.e. the American culture, which I find very superficial, materialistic, simplistic, manipulative, perhaps hypocritical. And I found all of those things very, very difficult. And then I found myself with 2 children and having to meet the financial expectations of an American spouse. And it was just unbelievably difficult. And I blamed my depression, which was really almost ever present, at least 80% of the time, on my work, because I didn't want to upset my wife. But I think really it was the marriage that just threw me into an abyss of despair. And coupled with a very stressful job, it was a really bad combination. After divorcing in around 2000, I got remarried in 2003. I had much more clearly defined expectations of this marriage, but once again I found myself a victim of circumstance, getting involved in a life that I had no way anticipated and saw, and my life just went down avenues that I in no way expected them to go, and it was just an incredibly stressful, unhappy period, and I was overwhelmed much of the time with depression. I was still trading. I'd had some bad luck. I'd had some bad luck in my work life. And then I had all this enormous financial pressure, being married again with young children. I had two more children, and it was just a pressure cooker of extreme magnitude. And I just struggled enormously. And there were periods when, in 2003, I remember I was having a tough time at work, and I just felt the financial obligation so huge that I was found once by my wife literally naked on the sofa, banging my pillow and bashing my fists into the pillow and crying inconsolably. And I was very, very depressed periodically, always on antidepressants. And really my worst periods were probably in the last 4 years, from like 2012 to 2016, when, for better or worse, I was investing my own money quite aggressively into the stock market. And I didn't really want to be doing this. Again, I couldn't understand how my life had come to this. I knew the effects this type of work had on me, and yet I was doing it, and I was doing it quite successfully, but I could never seem to make enough, because my wife did have a habit of spending massive amounts of money on God knows what, I truly don't know. And under this enormous stress through 2013 and 2014, there'd be times when I would say to her, I really felt suicidal, my life was no longer worth living, I wanted to end it all. But obviously I didn't really want to leave my children stranded, but I felt they'd be better off without me. Plus they'd get the life insurance and whatever money I had left. But I would usually get like this once I'd taken a big financial setback, which at that time tended slowly to come back. And yet towards the end of 2014, I had a sense of impending doom. I was struggling massively. Again, I'd been stuck in a life that I just couldn't recognize and had no desire to be in. And yet there was no way to get out. In my mind, I just simply couldn't see any way whatsoever of getting out. And I proceeded almost expectedly to lose about a third of what I was investing. This sent me into a major, major emotional breakdown, effectively, and I was hospitalized for a few days in Austin, Texas. And during that time, I realized that obviously this life was just destroying me, and I was effectively destroyed. But when I came out, I couldn't stomach the loss of the 1/3 of my capital reserves, because I saw no way that we could survive, because my wife had made it quite clear she didn't want to cut back on her spending, and I felt completely and utterly trapped. And so I hoped and prayed and tried to make the money back, but sadly and somewhat unluckily, over the next 10 months, the remaining 2/3 just drifted away, and it was a complete disaster. And by the end of that time, I was obviously utterly in despair. I was firmly thinking about ending it all. I knew that I didn't really want to leave my children in the lurch and to upset them, and I'm very cognizant of that. And I think that's the main reason I'm still here because I don't want to upset my children, but I really came to a sense of peace with the idea of ending it all. But I didn't do that, and it was at this point I decided to write my life story. It was quite painful to do. I knew I would upset some people, including my wife, but I just felt it had to be done. And really it was done with a view to explain incredibly accurately and honestly what I had been through for the last 50 plus years. And in many ways it was an extended explanation of why I was going to commit suicide, which I really thought I was. I really did think I was going to end my life. I was very comfortable with that idea, apart from the effect on the children, but I was beginning to convince myself that they'd be better off financially and emotionally without me. And I was truly and utterly devastated as I wrote that book. My wife read it and decided she wanted to divorce me, which further devastated me because even though I don't think we had the best relationship at all, I just couldn't contemplate yet more change. And over the next year, I was absolutely pretty much out of it. I could hardly function at all. I could hardly look after my children. I could hardly get up, and it was just, I really functioned in a very poor level. We moved to a different part of Texas, which I found extraordinarily stressful, and I was just utterly desperate and wanting to get out, and I could think of very little other than ending my life. And almost for days, for months and months and months, I was just consumed by ever-present suicidal ideation. Yet I didn't act upon it for reasons I've stated, and also for reasons that I didn't want, because we weren't yet divorced, and I didn't want what remaining money I had to go to my wife. I wanted to get the divorce done so I could leave it to the children. I wanted to get my life insurance sorted out so I could leave it to the children. And the divorce dragged on, so it meant I couldn't do anything in my mind. But during the end months of 2016, I struggled again to function. I hardly saw anybody or talked to anybody. I could barely entertain my children, who obviously I'm very close to. I couldn't actually have them over at my house because I just couldn't handle that, but I spent a lot of time during the day going to see them at school and at home, and just trying so hard to get out and interact with them. And it was completely and utterly desperate. Then, somewhat miraculously, towards the beginning of this year, after talking to a number of friends, and thankfully I have a number of friends, and contemplating things and meeting one or two other new people, I began to feel somewhat better, which sort of was very strange and almost frightening. In the past, I've always been afraid that if I feel better, there's something really bad coming down the pike. And I did actually, or have really for the last 6 months, felt better. I've tried to put distance between myself and what happened in the past, such that it's almost a different person. It's no longer me. It's obviously a different person I am now. I don't know what the future holds. I don't really know what I'm going to do, but I have a few modest plans. And thankfully for the last 6 months I have felt better. I have been still on antidepressants, but I'm still a little cautious and wondering if this will last, but hopefully it will. The actual writing of the book was an interesting process. It really sort of burst out of me. It was something I felt I had to do because I felt I had so much to say. I feel almost for me the most serious contributor to my depression has been the circumstances. I think the culture in America is very unsuited to me. I didn't understand the type of women, to be honest, that I was meeting and what their desires in life were. I find society is so obsessed with money and the need to make money and almost the need to spend money. Everything is sort of structured, whether it's healthcare or education, to sort of maximize expenditure for minimum of benefit, and I find that very difficult. There's a homogeneity of thinking which is difficult to compete with at times, almost like the tyranny of the masses, as I think de Tocqueville would call it. And I was stuck in a life, with two families that was very much sort of the archetype of that paradigm, as it were. And I really, really, really struggled monumentally because it wasn't me, it never was me. I hid those facts from the people closest to me. And ultimately it pretty much destroyed me and almost led to my premature demise. So I do think, although I have a propensity for depression and a chemical imbalance, these were overwhelmed by and massively exacerbated by the circumstances which I found, which were largely a product of my own very poor decision making, partly through naivety, stupidity, cowardice, I don't know. But I think what it tells me is If you're a British person coming over here, be very careful of the cultural differences. The people are very, very different. The way they grow up is different. Their expectations and their desires are very different. I think also, if you have situations in life that require tough decisions, get some advice from very close friends or confidants, and always do what feels right to yourself. Never do what doesn't feel right. Every one of the bad decisions I made, and there were maybe 4 or 5 extremely bad ones, I effectively knew they were the wrong thing to do, but I did them anyway. Even on at least 3 or 4 occasions, I initially said, no way, I'm not doing that, but after receiving some pressure, I relented. And so absolutely don't do that. Be true to yourself, be true to your own inner voice, be true to what you want to do, and think about what you want from life and not what anybody else wants. And that doesn't mean to say you're being selfish, it just means you're looking after yourself, and it's the way to look after yourself is the first step towards helping other people too. So be very, very true to yourself. Be very careful of what you're getting into. Look for red flags. If there are red flags in relationships, pay heed to them. I overlooked them all. But pay heed, those red flags aren't going to go away. They will get worse in time. So be very, very, very careful. And I think in my book, the way I've written it, has been very true and accurate. And arguably the last 30% of the book, I've been a little unfairly harsh on myself, but so be it. A number of people have said that. But the book is also very interesting with regard to its oil trading insights. I really do document an awful lot of fascinating oil trading history and funny stories and interesting stories, quite scandalous on some level. So I've hoped to make the book entertaining and interesting and educational and informative and hopefully helpful. Maybe people can learn from my mistakes. I think Voltaire said, is anybody so intelligent as to learn from the mistakes of others? And hopefully they can learn from my mistakes and not repeat them. Thank you very much. Again, this is Jonathan Ford, the author of Depression, Oil Trading, and a Mind at War with Itself. Thank you.